My name is Madison Cole. I am 42 years old, and I was a Marine, not just by title, not just by uniform. It was who I was down to my bones, down to the blood in my veins. I served with everything I had until one day I didn't. I never imagined that my greatest battle wouldn't be on a distant battlefield under enemy fire, but right here in a place that should have been safe, my own son's graduation. I stood there that morning beneath the two bright lights of the university auditorium, surrounded by hundreds of people who had no idea who I was or what I had sacrificed to stand where I stood. A security guard placed his hand on my shoulder. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This section is for family only." Family, I almost laughed. Because if family was the measure, then no, I didn't belong. At least not in their eyes. Not in the eyes of my late husband's family, who sat comfortably in the front row, faces carved from ice eyes brimming with silent judgment. They didn't just ask me to leave, they laughed. They humiliated me. They said I didn't belong. They called me a failure, and to them I was. The soldier who had been discharged. The widow whose husband died under questionable circumstances. The woman who had quietly faded into the background. But the thing about fading into the background is, sometimes people forget you're still there. And sometimes they forget that the ones they call failures are the very people who once stood between them and the darkness. I didn't resist. I didn't argue. I simply looked up toward the stage where my son, my only son, was moments away from stepping into his future. That's when it happened. The first man stood up. I didn't see his face at first, just the way he pushed back his chair, slow and deliberate. Then another man, then another, until 12 men scattered throughout the room all rose in unison, not a word, not a sound. Just the soft scrape of chairs and the sudden sharp intake of breath from those around them. I heard whispers ripple across the room. Who is she? Why are they standing? Who are those men? I didn't move. I couldn't. Because deep down I knew exactly who they were, and I knew exactly what was about to happen. We hadn't reached the end. This was just the beginning. The truth is, I wasn't supposed to be there, not in their eyes. But my son, my beautiful, stubborn, brave son, had written me a letter weeks earlier, one I carried in my pocket that day. He wrote, "Mom, I want you in the front row. No matter what anyone says, you belong there." And now here I was being escorted away until 12 men, 12 seals rose silently. And everything changed. I stood frozen. The world moved in slow motion. One of the guards hesitated. The other frowned confused. And still the 12 stood tall. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It wasn't outrage. It was something far heavier. Recognition, shame, and the weight of a truth too long buried. What happened next didn't need words. I didn't speak. I didn't plead. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones told without a single word. To understand how I ended up in that moment, how 12 seals rose for me, and how my son changed everything you need to know the morning that led me there. It started like any other morning. I woke before dawn. The house was quiet. The air smelled of old coffee and worn leather. My uniform, what was left of it, hung in the back of my closet, untouched for years. I ran my fingertips over the edge of the invitation. It wasn't formal. It wasn't embossed. It was handwritten. My son Ethan had sent it to me weeks earlier, scribbled in blue ink, like he used to write me letters when I was deployed. He wrote, "Mom, I want you in the front row. I know they don't, but I do. Please come." I must have read those words 100 times. Part of me wanted to tear it up. Part of me thought about staying home. It would have been easier, safer. But I didn't serve half my life just to hide from a fight I didn't start. I still remember the drive. Hands tight on the steering wheel. Heart pounding for no good reason except every reason. Because I knew exactly what would be waiting for me. The polished smiles, the polite cruelty, the unspoken message they'd spent years delivering. That I wasn't one of them. That I wasn't worthy. My late husband's parents never forgave me for surviving when he didn't. They said I failed him, failed the family, failed the name. And in some twisted way, I began to believe them. I arrived early. Too early. I watched the other families from the parking lot, mothers adjusting ties, fathers holding cameras, grandparents wiping away happy tears. I sat in my car, alone. Always alone. Until the clock pushed me forward. I wore the best thing I owned, a simple navy blazer slacks, and the pin my unit gave me when I retired. No medals, no glory, just quiet. When I walked through the auditorium doors, I saw them instantly. The family. His family. Their eyes found me, then looked through me. No greetings, no smiles. They barely concealed their disdain, as if my very presence spoiled the picture-perfect day they had painted. I kept my head down, took a seat near the back as far from them as possible. I didn't mind. I wasn't there for them. I was there for Ethan. Minutes stretched, the hall filled, names were called, applause swelled. And then came the moment I knew deep down I had been dreading. A young usher approached me. Her voice was soft but firm. "Excuse me, ma'am. This section is reserved. I'm afraid you'll have to move." I nodded. I stood. And that's when I felt it, the first touch on my shoulder. Not harsh, not forceful, just final. A security guard there to ensure I made no scene. The humiliation settled into my bones. I thought of leaving. I thought of running, but I didn't. Because in my pocket that letter still sat. Ethan's words still burned. And then just as I took the first step back, I heard it. The sound of a single chair sliding against the floor. I turned. Slowly. One man. Standing. Civilian clothes. Steady eyes. Then another. Then another. Until 12 of them scattered across the auditorium stood as one. There were no words, no announcements, just silent defiance. And the shift in the room was immediate. The whispers started. Who is she? Why are they standing? What's going on? And then, the softest voice I've ever known. Ethan, from the stage, clear and unshaken. That's my mother. In that moment, before I said a single word, the entire room stood. I wasn't always this version of myself, the quiet woman standing at the back of the room, the one people pass by without a second glance. There was a time when my name, Madison Cole, actually meant something. I was 19 when I joined the Marines, the youngest in my unit, the only woman. I didn't care. I wanted to serve. I needed to serve. It was the first time in my life I felt like I belonged somewhere. The discipline, the structure, the code, I lived by it. And for years it saved me from myself. I rose through the ranks faster than most. Not because I was better, but because I refused to quit. I trained harder, stayed longer, and fought with every ounce of who I was. I deployed 5 times. I led missions no one else wanted to take. I brought my people home until the day I didn't. 15 years ago, I made a decision that would cost me everything. We were in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. A routine training exercise went wrong. Shots fired where there should have been none. An ambush, they said. Chaos. 3 Marines died that day. And when the investigation began, the blame had to fall somewhere. My commanding officer, my husband at the time, was the one who froze. He was the one who panicked. But I took the fall. I told them it was my error, my oversight, my failure to act. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I still loved him. Maybe I thought I was saving a man who would someday stand up for me in return. I was wrong. The military court ruled it a dereliction of duty. I was offered an honorable discharge with conditions. It was quiet, buried, sealed away, so no one would look too closely. My career was over, my name erased from every honor board I had ever stood before. Worse than that, my so-called family erased me too. His parents, the Coles, belonged to a world I never truly understood. Old Virginia money, power, reputation above all else. When my husband died a few years later, car accident, they said they made sure every last trace of me was scrubbed from the family history. Except for Ethan, our son. I raised Ethan alone. No support, no visits. They didn't want me, and for the longest time I told myself I didn't want them either. But it changes you being discarded like that. It sinks into your skin, your bones. You stop expecting people to see you. You stop looking in mirrors because you already know what you'll find. I built a quiet life, a small house, a job that paid the bills, no more medals, no more headlines. But somewhere deep inside, I carried the weight of that day, of those lives, of the silence. And even though the world forgot me, I didn't forget myself. The Coles never truly forgave me, not for surviving, not for carrying their last name, and certainly not for raising Ethan in a world far beneath what they considered proper. They were the kind of family who spoke in coded glances and measured silences. They wore their wealth like armor custom suits, legacy jewelry, pristine manners sharpened into weapons. The Cole name carried weight in this town far beyond politics or money. It carried lineage, prestige, a history written by men who had never gotten their hands dirty. From the moment I entered their lives, I was the outsider, the soldier, the girl from nowhere. I was good enough to marry their son when he needed a rebellious phase, good enough to bear the Cole heir, but never good enough to stay. After his funeral, the door closed for good. They took control of Ethan's education, his environment, his future. Scholarships, private schools, summer programs. They paid for everything but made it very clear their money did not extend to me. Worse, they fed him stories. Stories about who I was, who I wasn't, what I had failed to be. I watched it happen in slow motion. The distance between me and my own son. The polite but careful tone he used when he came home on holidays. The way he never asked about my time in service or about the father he barely remembered. It wasn't his fault. He was a boy torn between two worlds. The cold, gleaming perfection of the Coles and the quieter, rougher edges of the life I built alone. I tried not to blame him. I tried to understand. But every time he chose their table instead of mine, every time he smiled at their approval, something inside me cracked a little deeper. I never told him the truth. About the war, about the investigation, about the weight I carried so his last name wouldn't be the one dragged through the mud. I thought I was protecting him, and maybe I was. Or maybe I was just too afraid that if he knew who I really was, he'd hate me too. The truth is, I never stopped loving him. Even when he drifted. Even when he believed their version of me more than mine. And that's why when the graduation invitation came, handwritten shaky letters that said, "Mom, I want you in the front row," I couldn't say no, no matter how much it hurt. The morning of Ethan's graduation, I woke before dawn. Sleep had been restless, full of half-formed memories, gunfire in the distance, and the echo of my own name shouted across endless desert winds. I dressed carefully, navy blazer, black slacks, nothing fancy, just enough to pass unnoticed. The drive was quiet. Long stretches of country roads winding toward the college campus, the May air too warm for the season. I arrived early, parking far from the main entrance. I sat in the car for 15 minutes before I worked up the nerve to step out. The campus was beautiful. Old brick buildings, manicured lawns, students bustling in cap and gown, families everywhere, mothers adjusting ties, fathers holding cameras, laughter rising in the morning breeze. I felt like a ghost walking through it all. When I reached the auditorium, I could already see them, the Coles. Front row. Perfectly pressed suits, smiles so smooth they barely looked real. My former mother-in-law sat with her pearl necklace and tightly folded hands, her gaze passing over me as if I were air. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. I found a seat near the back where I always seemed to belong. The ceremony began. Names called. Applause rising and falling in waves. Then I saw the usher approach. She whispered softly, but I heard every word. "This section is reserved for family, ma'am. I'm afraid you'll need to move." The words sliced cleanly like a blade, honed over years. I nodded. I stood. I could feel their eyes on me, the Coles. I could almost hear the unspoken thought, "She doesn't belong." I thought of leaving, but my hand brushed the pocket where Ethan's letter rested. And I remembered why I came. So I stayed. I stayed even when security moved closer. I stayed when the first whispers began. And in that stillness, in that breath between humiliation and erasure, something shifted. One chair scraped back, then another, 12 men, silent, steady, rising. I didn't understand yet, not fully. But I knew in that moment that the past was no longer mine to carry alone, and everything was about to change. They asked me to leave, softly, politely. But the weight of those words pressed heavier than any battlefield I had ever walked. "Ma'am," the usher said again, her voice dropping into something rehearsed, something she'd been told to say, "I'm afraid this section is for designated family members only." Family. That word again. Sharp as glass. Cold as steel. I glanced toward the front rows where the Coles sat perfectly still, perfectly composed. My former mother-in-law didn't even bother to turn her head fully. Her eyes shifted just enough to let me know she had seen me, and chosen to see through me. I felt the warmth rise behind my ears, that familiar flush of quiet humiliation. The kind that doesn't show in your face but burns deep inside your ribs. The kind you learn to swallow down because life doesn't stop for your dignity. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the usher's eyes already moved past me. I wasn't a person to her. I was a problem to solve. A glitch in the system. An unwanted presence. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. My throat tightened. I shifted one foot back, stepping toward the aisle. And then I saw him. Ethan. My son stood near the edge of the stage, still in his gown and cap, still holding the program. His name would be called in less than 5 minutes. The moment he'd worked toward for 4 long years. But his eyes were locked on me. I hadn't seen that expression in years. Uncertainty, confusion. Something else too. Something I couldn't quite name yet. A flicker, a hesitation. Our eyes met for the briefest second. And I saw him, really saw him, not as the boy who had drifted from me, not as the teenager shaped by the Coles, but as the child I had once held in my arms. The boy who used to wait at the window for me to come home. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He just stood there. I could tell he wasn't sure what he was witnessing. He'd heard the stories, I knew that. The carefully crafted lies. The half-truths dressed up as concern. The narrative the Coles had fed him since the day his father died, that I was unstable, that I was dangerous, that I was broken. But something in his face told me, at least for that moment, he wasn't so sure anymore. I held his gaze for as long as I could. Then the pressure on my shoulder returned. The usher again, soft but firmer this time. "Please, ma'am." The security guards began moving in. 2 of them, young, professional. No malice in their eyes, just the mechanical duty of people following orders. They weren't the enemy, they didn't even know the war they'd just stepped into. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing the edges of the folded card. The one Ethan had written. The words that had pulled me here against every instinct of self-preservation. I thought about showing it to them. I thought about holding it up, saying, "My son invited me. I belong here." But the words stuck. Because deep down, I knew what would happen. A piece of paper wouldn't change the way these people saw me. Nothing ever had. So I lowered my hand, stepped back another inch. The first guard moved in slightly closer, positioning himself beside me. Not aggressive, not threatening. Just there, an undeniable presence designed to shepherd me away without the mess of conflict. And all around us, the audience stayed frozen. No one looked, no one intervened. Hundreds of faces trained on the stage, on their phones, on anything but the quiet dismantling of one woman's last shred of belonging. That's the thing about shame, it rarely needs an audience to survive. But when it finds one, it burns deeper. I caught one last glimpse of Ethan. His hands tightened around the edges of the program. His lips parted slightly, as if to say something, but no sound came. And in that silence, I felt it. The old weight. The familiar descent. The moment where a person either disappears entirely or decides not to. I didn't know then which path I'd choose. All I knew was that every breath hurt a little more, and that for the first time in years, I wanted to fight. Not for me, not for the past, but for the boy on that stage. I could have left. I should have left. But I didn't. I stood there, back against the side wall. The weight of every eye that wasn't looking at me pressing heavier than if they had. The security guard stayed close, his hand no longer on my shoulder, but hovering near enough to remind me my presence here was an inconvenience, a disruption. The ceremony continued. Names were called. Applause rose and fell in polite waves. I tried to focus on Ethan standing on the stage, his gown pressed, his cap slightly tilted. But my gaze kept pulling against my will back to the front row, to them. The Coles sat exactly as they always had, unmoved, untouched, as if none of this involved them at all. But it did. Oh, it did. I watched as my former mother-in-law leaned toward the man beside her. Her brother, a senator whose name appeared on too many donor plaques in this town. She whispered something. He gave the smallest smirk. It was nothing. It was everything. And then the words came, soft, venomous, laced with the kind of quiet cruelty that only people like them could perfect. "She's already done enough to disgrace this family," someone murmured. I couldn't tell which of them said it. And then louder, clearer, another voice. "She did enough to kill her husband. She doesn't need to humiliate her son, too." The words sliced through the air like a blade, deliberate, calculated. I felt my breath catch. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Forgot the people, the lights, the stage. All I could hear was the blood in my ears and that single sentence repeating itself over and over again. She did enough to kill her husband. I knew this was what they believed. I had always known. But hearing it spoken so casually, so publicly, it felt like a new kind of death. I steadied myself against the wall. My hand trembled slightly, and I clenched it into a fist before anyone could see. I should have fought back, should have said something. But how do you argue with people who don't believe you even deserve a voice? I glanced at Ethan again. He was still watching me. For a split second, our eyes locked, and I wondered if he had heard it too. If the words had reached him. If they had lodged somewhere in the soft, unscarred parts of his heart. I didn't know. All I knew was the familiar weight of shame rising again. The sharp memory of the day they called me into that courtroom. The way I signed my name on the discharge papers with a hand that barely stopped shaking. I took the blame then. I swallowed the ruin. I thought it was for something greater, for family, for love. But standing here now years later, nothing about it felt noble. It felt hollow. The security guard shifted beside me. The usher checked her clipboard again, as if she could erase me with the right combination of paper and ink. I could feel the tears pressing behind my eyes. Not from sadness, no, not that, but from fury held too long beneath the surface. From the sick, bitter knowledge that even now, after all this time, they still held the power to reduce me to nothing. But I wasn't nothing. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling the folded card through the fabric of my blazer. The one with Ethan's handwriting. The one that said, "Mom, I want you there." And I held on to that. Because sometimes the world will lie to you. Sometimes it will strip you bare and leave you standing alone. But the truth, when it comes, always finds its way back. I stayed. Not because I wasn't broken, but because I was. And because somewhere deep in the heart of this moment, I knew this wasn't over yet. I was seconds away from giving in. One more breath, one more step, and I would have let them push me out. Quietly, politely, permanently. The security guard's hand shifted closer. The usher avoided my eyes. My feet felt like they were moving on their own, inching toward the side exit. And then a hand, firm but gentle, settled on my shoulder. I flinched instinctively, my breath caught in my chest. But this touch, it wasn't the guard's. It wasn't another usher. I turned, slowly, and saw him. I didn't recognize his face at first. Civilian clothes, mid-40s, close-cropped hair, steady eyes. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't frowning. His expression held something deeper, something that didn't belong to this room or this moment, but to a life that existed far beyond it. He said nothing to me. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled something out, small, round, gleaming under the overhead lights. A coin. No, not just any coin. A challenge coin. I knew the weight of those. I knew what they meant. They weren't given. They were earned. The man stepped forward, placing himself between me and the guards. He held the coin in his open palm, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the soft hum of the auditorium. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "Not today." The words didn't register immediately. For a moment the world tilted, and I had to blink twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The first guard hesitated. The usher's clipboard lowered an inch. And then, before I could process it fully, another chair scraped back. Then another. And another. Across the room, scattered through the rows, more figures stood, men in plain clothes. Unremarkable at first glance, but unmistakable once you knew where to look. Their eyes met mine, one by one. Each one held something small in his hand. A coin, a pin, a symbol. 12 in total. The challenge coin in front of me bore the emblem I would never forget, the trident of the United States Navy SEALs. I had seen it in the field. I had seen it in places no map could chart. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. The man in front of me didn't move. He just stood there, his stance relaxed but immovable. I served under her, he added, quieter now. And I would again. The security guards exchanged a glance, uncertain, untrained for this. They weren't sure what they were looking at, but I was. I knew every scar that wasn't visible. I knew every line etched into those faces. I knew them, and they knew me. For a breathless moment, the entire auditorium seemed to shift. The noise dulled. The lights blurred. Even the Coles, so confident in their control, turned their heads with a flicker of something I hadn't seen on their faces before, unease. I swallowed hard. I tried to find words, any words, but I had none. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered with a scar above his left eye, gave me the smallest nod. Recognition, respect. A reminder that I was not invisible, not today. My fingers closed around the folded letter in my pocket. I could feel the shape of Ethan's handwriting through the fabric, as real as the heartbeat pounding beneath my ribs. I wasn't sure if this was real. I wasn't sure how they knew, how they came, why now. But somewhere deep inside, a part of me I thought had long since died, flickered back to life. I wasn't alone. I stepped back, steadied myself, and for the first time that morning, I lifted my chin. The ceremony continued. The announcer called another name. Applause followed. The machine of the day kept moving. But everything had shifted. 12 men stood where no one expected them to. And I stayed exactly where I was. At first I thought it was just the one man, the single figure standing between me and the edge of disgrace. But then another chair scraped back, then another, and another. One by one they rose. I counted without meaning to. 3, 4, 6, 9. By the time the 12th man stood, the entire room had shifted. The ceremony continued on autopilot, names called, hands clapped, but something deeper, quieter had cracked open beneath it all. They weren't just strangers. I knew those faces. Even with the years that had passed, even dressed in civilian clothes, I knew. My stomach twisted as recognition crept over me. One man tilted his head slightly, and in that small movement, memory flooded back. Kandahar. Helmand. The desert night that changed everything. These men, they were my unit, my brothers. We had been young then, so young, scared, determined, alive in ways that only people who have seen death too closely can understand. We had marched side by side, fought side by side, and nearly died side by side. My knees nearly gave out. I steadied myself against the wall, my breath hitching in my throat. Why were they here? Why now? The answer pressed down on me before I could ask, because they remembered. They remembered what no one else did, what the world had been willing to forget. They remembered the day I made a choice to go back when no one else would. The day I carried men on my back through smoke and sand because the man who should have led them, my husband, froze and ran. It wasn't the medals, it wasn't the rank, it was them. They were the only evidence that I had not imagined who I once was. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, not from weakness, but from the weight of something I hadn't felt in so long: belonging, vindication, and something dangerously close to hope. One of the men, an older soldier with deep lines around his mouth, met my gaze and gave me the slightest nod. It was the same nod we used to share before moving into enemy territory. A silent vow. I swallowed hard. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out the announcer calling the next name. I looked toward Ethan again. He stood frozen near the edge of the stage, his expression caught between confusion and something deeper. His fingers clenched the rolled-up program. His eyes darted between me and the 12 men standing sentinel around the room. He didn't understand yet. Not fully, but I could see the shift beginning in him too. The Coles, still in their perfect row, began to murmur, confused, unsettled for the first time in decades. I saw my former mother-in-law's face tighten, her hands clenching into white-knuckled fists. And through it all I stayed still. I didn't move, I didn't speak. Because sometimes justice doesn't come through noise. Sometimes it comes through silence so deafening it can split the air in two. Memory isn't linear. It comes in fragments and flashes. It washes over you like heat waves from desert sand, distorted, sharp, searing. That day in Afghanistan still lives inside me. Even now. Even here. I can feel the weight of the gear on my back, the sting of sweat in my eyes, the smell of metal and smoke thick enough to choke you. The air had been hot, unnaturally hot, and everything had gone wrong in less than 5 minutes. It was supposed to be routine. That's what they always say before everything unravels. The explosion hit first, then gunfire, and then nothing. Nothing but chaos, screams, static on the comms, and the sharp realization that the one person who should have been leading us, my husband, was gone. I still don't know when he ran, or why. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he froze. Maybe some part of him decided his life was worth more than ours. I remember the moment I realized what had happened. The sound of the radio going dead. The crack of bullets slicing the air. And then I moved. I don't remember deciding to. My legs just carried me, through the sand, through the fire, through the bodies. I pulled them out one by one, 5 men. Some conscious, some half-dead, all of them bleeding into the dirt. I carried them on my back sometimes, 2 at a time. I dragged them by the arms when I couldn't lift them anymore. My knees buckled, my lungs screamed. My hands tore open at the seams. But I didn't stop. I didn't stop because no one else was coming. And I didn't stop because I knew if I let go, they would die. We lost 3 that day, but we could have lost them all. I made it back to the extraction point with nothing left in me but adrenaline and despair. And when I looked into my husband's eyes standing there untouched alive, I knew. I knew he would never speak of it. I knew he would let me carry the blame. And when the formal inquiry began, I took the fall. I signed the papers. I made the story fit their narrative. I protected the family name. And they let me. They let me fall alone. That moment, that choice followed me every day since. It clawed at the back of my mind, ate into my bones. And somehow, even now, standing in a university auditorium half a world away, I could feel the weight of it pressing down. But I also felt something else. The eyes of the men I had saved, men who were still breathing because I didn't let them die. They were here. They remembered. Even if no one else ever had. The murmurs rippled louder through the auditorium. The Coles shifted uncomfortably. I could see the tightness around their mouths, the way they clutched their programs a little too tightly. Like paper shields could protect them from what was unfolding. And then the room shifted again. A figure tall, broad, moving with the kind of authority that isn't taught but earned, stepped forward from the back. I knew him before he spoke. Retired General Thomas Kesler. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. But I remembered the last time I did, he was bleeding out, pinned beneath debris in Kandahar. His life slipping away inch by inch until I pulled him from the wreckage. He adjusted his tie with one steady hand and stepped toward the front without waiting for permission. His voice when it came was steady but carried like a thunderclap. Before we continue, he said calmly, "I believe I should say something." The announcer stuttered, unsure what to do. But the general kept going. He turned deliberately toward the crowd, toward the Coles, toward me. "I know this woman," he said. His eyes never left mine. "She saved my life. She saved more lives than most of us can count. And she did it without hesitation, without glory, without expectation of recognition." A wave of gas swept through the rows. Faces turned. He paused, glancing toward Ethan, then back to me. "I owe her my life," he said quietly. And I think it's time someone finally said that out loud. The words hit me harder than I expected. For years I had stopped letting myself believe that truth mattered. I had buried it so deep beneath layers of silence, lies, and survival, that hearing it spoken publicly clearly felt almost foreign. The general gave me a slight nod, then stepped back. And for a breathless heartbeat, the entire room held still. The Coles looked like statues, unmoving, unnerved. I watched as my former mother-in-law's face paled, her mouth opening slightly before snapping shut. The senator beside her adjusted his collar, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Even from a distance, I could see the way their careful masks began to crack. The murmurs rose. The energy in the room shifted. Something irreversible had begun. And I did nothing. I stood exactly where I was, hands by my sides, eyes forward. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend myself. The truth at last was no longer mine alone to carry. I saw Ethan glance between me and the Coles. His face, once carefully schooled into polite detachment, began to shift. Confusion gave way to something sharper, a question forming that no one could quite answer. And still I stayed silent, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any voice, and sometimes standing still is the bravest thing you can do. The Coles began whispering. The father, the mother, the siblings. Faces drawn tight, eyes flickering toward the exits. The fortress of their control was slipping brick by brick. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The room was no longer theirs. For a moment I thought time had stopped. The air in the auditorium felt different, heavier, sharper, like the room itself was holding its breath. I could still hear the announcer's voice in the distance, names being called, polite applause rising and falling. But none of it touched me. None of it reached where I stood. My eyes were on Ethan. And his were on me. Something in his face had changed. I could see it, the conflict, the confusion, the slow unraveling of everything he'd been told. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He stood frozen near the side of the stage, the graduation program crushed slightly in his hand. For years I had wondered what he believed. Whether the stories they told him had taken root. Whether he'd come to see me through their lens, the failure, the disgrace, the woman who never quite fit. But in that moment, he wasn't looking at me like that. He was searching for something, some sliver of truth to hold on to. And then before anyone could stop him, he stepped forward. I didn't breathe. No one did. Ethan walked to the microphone with slow, deliberate steps. The dean at the podium shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. A ripple moved through the audience, confusion and curiosity scattered whispers. He didn't look at them. He looked at me. And when he spoke, his voice was clear, steady, and somehow louder than the sound system itself. That's my mother. 3 words. Only 3. But they cracked something open in the air around us. The whispers grew louder. The Coles straightened in their seats, shock and indignation flashing across their faces in quick succession. One of them, his aunt, I think, reached out as if to pull him back, but Ethan didn't stop. He stepped fully into the center of the stage, hands trembling slightly. His breath visible in the way his chest rose and fell. He cleared his throat once. And then I think maybe some of you have heard stories about her. I know I have. His voice faltered for half a second. He swallowed. She's been called a lot of things over the years, and I guess for a long time I believed some of it. Or I didn't ask enough questions. I felt my heart ache at those words, gentle, honest, painfully raw. He glanced toward the front row. His grandmother stiffened her jaw, clenched so tightly it looked painful. But this woman, Ethan continued, voice gaining strength. This woman raised me alone. She showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every hospital visit, every birthday, even when no one else thought she belonged. His eyes found mine again. And the truth is, I'm standing here because of her. The room was utterly still. The kind of stillness you only find in sanctuaries and battlefields. No applause, no interruptions, just the weight of truth hanging in the air like something sacred. I'm proud to call her my mother, he finished quietly, and I don't care who hears it. I felt my hands trembling, pressed tightly against the seams of my blazer. My breath caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. For so long, I had stopped hoping for this moment, stopped imagining he would ever see me really see me. And yet, here we were. The announcer fumbled slightly before stepping aside. Ethan lowered the microphone, but didn't return to his place among the graduates. He stayed near the steps, standing tall, his shoulders squared in quiet defiance. I could see at the beginnings of a man learning to stand for something, maybe for the first time. And I stayed where I was. I didn't move toward him. I didn't cry. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else take the lead. Let them choose you without being asked. The room stayed hushed, tense, but the energy had shifted. The ground beneath me felt steadier, the air less suffocating, and for the first time in years, I felt it. A flicker of something I hadn't dared to name. Redemption. The room was silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come often. Not in places like this. Not in the middle of ceremonies meant to be polished, predictable, and polite. It was the kind of silence you feel in your skin, in your teeth, in the weight of your own breath. I stood frozen, my heart hammered in my chest. My hands still pressed flat against my sides, as if holding me upright. Ethan remained near the stage, not moving, not speaking, but I could see the way his shoulders squared, how he refused to look away from me now. And then one final sound. A chair scraped softly against the polished floor. The last man, the 12th, stood. He was older than the others, his hair mostly gray, his face drawn with lines etched by time and memory. But his eyes were clear, steady. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He stepped forward with the same deliberate, grounded calm that I remembered from the field, the kind of calm that only comes from walking through hell and somehow coming back whole. I recognized him then. Chief Petty Officer Andrew Vance. I hadn't seen him in over 15 years. The last time had been in a desert far from this auditorium. Both of us soaked in dust and blood. Both of us barely alive. He approached slowly, the sound of his footsteps louder than it should have been in that heavy silence. The security guard, still frozen in place, stepped aside without being told. No one stopped him. When he reached me, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded envelope. My breath caught. I knew what it was before he even offered it. His voice, when it came, was low, meant for me alone. He asked me to give you this, he said softly. I didn't know when, or if I ever should, but I think it's time. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at the envelope, at the edges worn soft from years of being handled, the handwriting familiar and strange all at once. I felt my fingers tremble as I took it. The paper was warm from his pocket, but I shivered as I closed my hand around it. I hadn't seen my husband's handwriting since the day they told me he was gone. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Chief Vance stepped back without another word. He returned to his place, joining the others, who still stood motionless in silent unity. I lowered my eyes to the envelope. My name was written on the front in a hand I would never forget. Madison. Just that. No rank, no title, no pretense. My thumb brushed the flap. For a heartbeat, I wasn't here. I was somewhere else entirely. The desert, the wind, the fire. I opened it. The paper inside shook as I unfolded it. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to read. I'm sorry, the first words burned into me. I should have stayed. I should have led. I ran. And it has haunted me every day since. I felt the tears rise sharp and hot, but I held them back. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you're still standing. I don't deserve it. I never did. But you were always braver than me. Please, forgive me. I swallowed hard, the weight of the words cutting deeper than any wound I'd ever carried. My knees almost buckled, but I locked them tight, grounding myself in the present, in the truth of what I held. He had known. All along he had known. And still he let me fall alone. But now the truth was mine to hold. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it close to my heart, and raised my eyes. The auditorium remained silent. But the silence was different now, not heavy with shame, but filled with something else, something breaking open, something long overdue. And still I didn't speak, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes it just needs to be seen. I don't know how long I stood there, the letter pressed against my chest, my fingers trembling slightly around the fragile paper. The weight of his words settled into me like the final piece of a puzzle I'd stopped believing I would ever solve. For years I thought I was the only one who knew the truth. For years I thought I would carry it to my grave. But now here, under the harsh lights of an ordinary auditorium, the truth had finally stepped into the open. I looked up to find Ethan still standing on the stage, his eyes fixed on me, on the letter, on the weight of everything that had just unraveled. And then, without prompting, without ceremony, he moved. I watched as he stepped back toward the microphone, his movements deliberate, his hands shaking only slightly. The announcer faltered, unsure whether to stop him, but the moment had already slipped beyond anyone's control. Ethan cleared his throat. The microphone picked up the sound sharp against the silence, and then he spoke. My father wrote my mother a letter before he died. His voice was soft, but each word landed like a stone dropped into still water. For most of my life, I didn't know who she really was. I didn't know what she'd given up, or what she'd protected me from. He paused, looking down at the folded paper in his hands. His brow furrowed, and I could see the battle playing out behind his eyes. The boy he had been colliding with the man he was becoming. He looked up again. I don't know how many of you know the full story. He continued quietly. I don't think I even knew it until today. He took a breath, The room was so quiet I could hear it, the rise and fall of his chest. "But I've read it now," he said. "I've read his words. And I know this: the person who should have stood up didn't. And the person who shouldn't have had to did." A murmur rippled through the crowd, subdued, breathless. All eyes shifted toward me, toward the Coles, toward the fragments of a family that no longer made sense under the weight of the truth. Ethan swallowed his voice, catching slightly. "My mother saved lives. She carried the cost of someone else's failure, and she did it alone." He looked at me, straight through me, and something broke loose in my chest. "I'm proud of her," he said. "I'm proud to be her son." The words landed with a weight I could barely hold. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tears on my skin, hot, silent, unstoppable. The Coles were frozen in their seats. My former mother-in-law looked as if every breath was a struggle. The senator beside her shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. The illusion they had spent years building of control of righteousness was unraveling strand by strand. And then, before anyone could move, Ethan stepped down from the stage. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He walked toward me. The sea of faces faded to nothing. The whispers dulled into a low hum. All I could see was him, my son, walking toward me with something I had long since stopped hoping to find in his eyes: pride and love. When he reached me, he didn't say a word. He just took my hand. His fingers wrapped around mine, warm, steady, real, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself breathe. The applause started somewhere deep in the crowd, tentative, soft, but it grew. Row by row, person by person. Not loud, not raucous, but reverent. I stood there, my son's hand in mine, the letters still pressed to my heart. And for the first time I knew without doubt that I didn't have to stand alone anymore. The applause wasn't unanimous. Some people stood. Some clapped, hesitant at first, then with more conviction as the weight of the moment settled over them. But others stayed seated, arms folded, expressions carefully blank. I saw it. I saw all of it. The ones who couldn't quite decide whether to join in or look away. The ones who whispered behind hands, who glanced nervously at the Coles before daring to move. The theater of it all, the calculations people make when truth crashes into comfort. I didn't blame them. It's easier to stay still than to rise for something you don't fully understand. As the last echoes of clapping died down, the real shift began, not loud, not public, but in the faces of those who mattered. I watched my former mother-in-law, Eleanor Cole, lower her hands into her lap, her face drained of color, her breath shallow. She didn't stand. She didn't clap. Instead, her lips pressed into a thin, brittle line before she broke. Her hands shook as she wiped at her eyes, her entire frame trembling. And then, loud enough for the first two rows to hear, but no further, she whispered through clenched teeth, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Her voice cracked on the last word. Beside her, the senator, her brother, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I saw her reach for her husband's arm, his lifeless stare fixed somewhere above the stage. "It was Charles," she choked out, her voice too thin to control. "It was his fault. He should have. I didn't know. I didn't know." Her words spiraled, half-formed, tangled in her own unraveling dignity. I stood where I was silent. I didn't flinch. I didn't move toward her. I had nothing left to give that story. The ceremony continued mechanically, awkwardly. Names were called. Diplomas handed out. But the room no longer belonged to the graduates. It belonged to something else, something raw and unscripted, that no one could quite contain. And the outside world noticed. It started, small whispers on the edge of the crowd, photos snapped with shaking hands. But by the time Ethan and I stepped outside into the sun, my phone buzzed twice in my pocket. Then 3 times, then nonstop. The first post hit social media within minutes. Who was the woman at St. Albans today? Why did SEALs stand for her? Another powerful moment. Soldiers' sacrifice finally recognized after years of silence. But not all the voices were kind. The third post hit harder. Traitor hero, shocking revelation divides local community as family feud explodes at graduation. I felt the words like static in the air around me. I had known somewhere deep down that this wouldn't end when the doors closed. Truth unsettles. It doesn't fit neatly into headlines. Some people would believe me, some never would. I exhaled slowly, the sun warm against my skin. Ethan walked beside me, silent, his expression unreadable. The noise around us faded as we moved further from the building, but the echoes remained inside me, inside him, inside everyone who had witnessed the undoing of a story too carefully told for too long. I didn't speak. Not yet. Not when so much was still breaking open. We drove home in silence. The roads blurred past green fields and quiet streets that should have felt familiar, but somehow didn't. The weight of the day pressed against every breath, every heartbeat. I kept my eyes on the horizon, hands steady on the wheel. Ethan sat beside me, the letter folded carefully in his lap, his gaze distant. When we reached the house, I parked without speaking. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. And then his voice low, unsure. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. I didn't look at him right away. I watched the wind move through the trees instead. "I wanted to," I said finally. "But I didn't know how, and I was afraid." He nodded slowly, not in anger, but in understanding. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words took time. "They told me you were unstable," he said quietly. "That you weren't right. That I shouldn't ask too many questions." His voice cracked. "They lied." I turned to him, then finally meeting his eyes. "They did what they thought would protect their version of the truth," I said gently, "and I let them, for a long time." The silence between us stretched thick, but no longer hostile. And then he spoke again. "I don't think I've really known who I am until today," he murmured. "I don't think I ever really saw you." I felt the sting behind my eyes, but blinked it back. "Seeing takes time," I whispered. "It takes courage, too." He nodded. And then, without warning, he reached across the console and took my hand. A small gesture, a quiet one, but enough. We sat there like that for a long while, before he finally let go, exhaling a shaky breath. "I'm going to talk to them," he said quietly. "To my grandparents. They need to hear it." I didn't argue. I didn't caution him. I only nodded. Later that evening, after he left for the Coles estate, I sat alone on the porch. The sky turned from gold to deep indigo, the last traces of sunlight fading behind the hills. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A message, a name I hadn't seen in years. Andrew Vance. I hesitated before opening it. "You won today, but the truth is you won a long time ago. Some of us just needed time to catch up." I let out a soft breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The message wasn't long. It didn't need to be. I folded the phone into my lap, closing my eyes. The breeze touched my skin. The night settled. I didn't need a headline to tell me who I was. I didn't need the world's permission to stand. I had stood. And that was enough. The house felt different when I returned. It wasn't bigger, it wasn't brighter. But something had shifted, something quiet but real. The weight I'd carried for so long had begun to lift, not completely, but enough that my breath came easier. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my fingers tracing the edge of the keys in my palm. The silence was gentle, not heavy. The kind of silence that comes after a long storm has finally passed. Ethan arrived 2 days later. He didn't make a speech. He didn't offer apologies or explanations. He just stood on the porch with a single bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes tired but clear. "I'm staying here," he said simply. I nodded, stepped aside, let him in. We didn't need to say more than that. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't come in grand declarations. Sometimes it's in the small, ordinary moments, sharing coffee in the morning, passing each other in the hall, learning the rhythm of a life rebuilt. The Coles didn't call. I didn't expect them to. Whatever had shattered that day wasn't something words could repair. But I found somewhere deep in the quiet I didn't need them to. I didn't need their approval. I never had. Ethan settled into the guest room that first night. I heard him moving softly, the sound of drawers opening, the soft click of a light switch. It was strange and familiar all at once, like reaching for something you thought was lost, and finding it unexpectedly still there. Before bed, I opened the drawer of my bedside table and took out the letter. His letter. The edges were worn now, the creases soft from too many readings. But the words inside still carried the same weight, the same confession, the same brokenness, the same small ember of regret. I read it one last time under the soft lamplight, my fingers brushing over his name. And then carefully, deliberately, I folded it, placed it back into the envelope, and closed the drawer. Not because I wanted to forget, but because some stories need to end. Some ghosts need to rest. And for the first time in years, I let them. The letter came by registered mail. A thick envelope with no fanfare, no ceremony, just a simple return address from the Department of Defense. I sat with it in my lap for nearly an hour before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Clean, crisp, the language formal, the signature familiar in its distance. And beneath it, carefully enclosed, was the medal. My medal. The Distinguished Service Cross. Awarded. Revoked. Now. Restored. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just held it. The weight of it unfamiliar after so many years, the cool metal pressing into my skin, like a memory I hadn't known I still carried. It didn't change anything. And yet, it changed everything. I didn't tell Ethan right away. Some things aren't about recognition. Some things are about closure. A week later, I drove to the coast. The air was sharp with salt, the waves restless under the pale morning sky. I stood at the water's edge with the wind tugging at my hair, the sound of the sea filling every quiet space inside me. In my hand, I held something small, something older than the metal, older than the letter, a coin. One of the old challenge coins I had carried for years. Worn smooth at the edges, the emblem faded, but intact. I ran my thumb over it once, twice, and then I let it go. The coin arced through the air, caught the light for a heartbeat, and vanished into the waves. I watched the water swallow it. And with it the weight of everything I had carried alone. I didn't need the coin to remember who I was. I didn't need the medal to prove it. The past had shaped me, but it didn't own me. I stood there for a long time, the sea brushing against the soles of my boots, the horizon stretched wide and endless ahead. When I turned to leave, I felt lighter, not empty, not erased, but whole in a way I hadn't thought possible. Some stories end not with the sound of applause, but with the sound of waves, and that I thought was enough. I didn't come there to win. I didn't come to prove anything. I came because my son asked me to. Because he wrote 7 simple words that I couldn't shake from my heart. Mom, I want you in the front row. That's all I wanted. I thought I'd stand at the back. I thought I'd disappear the way I always had, silently, politely. But sometimes the world decides differently. I learned something that day. I learned that justice doesn't always come wrapped in noise. It doesn't always arrive with anger or raised voices. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the standing of 12 men who owe you nothing but remember everything. In the voice of your child, clear and steady, saying the words you thought you'd never hear. That's my mother. I used to believe I had to carry everything alone. That silence was safer than the truth. But standing there hand in hand with my son, I realized, sometimes it takes just one person brave enough to speak. And sometimes, the right people will stand with you. So if you're listening wherever you are, if you find yourself standing alone, I hope you'll remember this: stand up for what's right, even if no one else is standing with you yet. Because one day, maybe when you least expect it, someone will. Before we say goodbye, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee by your side? Or maybe it's a late night when stories like this keep you company in the stillness? Let us know in the comments. I promise. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of something you once believed in, or maybe something you forgot along the way, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, in second chances. Thank you for spending your time here with us today, for listening, for feeling. Wherever you are in the world, whatever weight you're carrying, I hope you'll take this story with you. I hope it reminds you that sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care of yourself. Be gentle with the world, and we'll see you in the next story.